So you should have a live streamed notice now.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, it looks like
it has occasionally stopped raining in Glasgow. People in the chat claiming it always rains in Glasgow. In the past, it does not rain. It's not here to be raining now. It will rain in the future, but maybe not all the
That's
time.
all fine. Okay, so it looks like we are live at the moment. It looks like we are live streaming, which is always a good thing when technology works. So there we go. Okay, so just to remind everyone, just as we're starting, that this event, as all of our Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic events, are covered by our code of conduct, which I will now paste onto the chat, the link to our code of conduct. And also, if any of you are posting on social media or live tweeting, the hashtag is Queer Faith Fantasy, hashtag Queer Faith Fantasy, again on the chat now for everyone. Okay, so let's get this started. Yeah, as Matt would say, good evening, at least for us over here in Glasgow, or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world when you're joining us. And it's lovely to see all the locations on the chat. I'm Dr. Dimitra Fimi. I am a senior lecturer in fantasy and children's literature at the University of Glasgow, and I co-direct the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here as well. We are, of course, here today to celebrate our own Dr. Taylor Driggers' new book, and we will get on with this very shortly. But I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all on behalf of the Centre. So the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic was founded in September 2020, but that followed over 5 years of earlier fantasy-related activities, teaching, research, and public engagement here at Glasgow. Our remit is to conduct and disseminate world-leading research in fantasy and the fantastic, to educate and support a diverse cohort of scholars working on fantasy at MLit, PhD, DFA, and postdoctoral level, and to bring together academia and the wider fantasy community, including creators and performers, in order to understand the fantasy's transformative intellectual, cultural, and social potential. So some of our flagship activities include the Fantasy MLit program, which is the only fantasy-focused postgraduate program in the world right now. The annual fantasy conference that we've been running for a while, GIFCON, the 2022 one will be our 5th one, and it'll be held online. I will add links to all of those in a minute on the chat. Our Once and Future Fantasies conference in July 2022, co-sponsored with the International Association for the Fantastic and the Arts, with keynotes by Nala Hopkinson and Professor Dame Marina Warner. And our very successful public-facing events like this one, actually, both on campus and online, involving authors, designers, artists, and academics working on all aspects of fantasy. And you can find many of recordings of our past events on our YouTube channel. But the main research activity we're concerned with today is the new fantasy book series with Bloomsbury Academic Perspectives on Fantasy, which publishes monographs and edited collections on fantasy and the fantastic, and has now just been officially launched with Taylor's book, which is our very first one. So in a minute, my co-editors and I will briefly introduce the book series, and then we'll pass on the baton to Taylor, Dr. Taylor Driggers, Glasgow PhD graduate, teaching assistant alongside the fantasy team here, and the author of Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature, Fantastic Incarnations, and the Deconstruction of Theology, which is, of course, the book we're celebrating today. Taylor will talk to us about the book, which explores works by C.S. Lewis, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Angela Carter, among others, showing how fantasy literature can help women and LGBTQ plus people marginalized by Christianity reclaim and re-envision their theological traditions. He will then be joined by Anglia Ruskin University postgraduate researcher Meg McDonald, who is at the final stages of a PhD on God's Wall to Wall, the Rise and Fall of Gods in Genre Fantasy, 1989 to 2020, for a conversation about fantasy's affordances for theology and how their respective research projects respond to existing scholarship in fantasy, theology, and religious studies. So let me first introduce you then, as we're going to do the introduction to the series first, let me introduce you to my co-editors. So Brian Atterberry, first of all, is Professor of English at Idaho State University in the USA. He's the author of many monographs, including Stories About Stories, Fantasy and the Remaking of Myth, and there's new books coming out quite soon. He received the Distinguished Scholarship Award from the International Association of the Fantastic in the Arts in 1991, the Pilgrim Award from the Science Fiction Research Association in 2009, and has twice won the Mythopoeic Scholarship Award. And then Matthew Sangster is Senior Lecturer in Romantic Studies, Fantasy and Cultural History at the University of Glasgow. He has published widely on authorship, literary institutions, city imaginaries, digital humanities, and fantasy culture. He co-curated the 2011 centenary exhibition, The Worlds of Mervyn Peake, at the British Library, where he's currently working on further fantasy-related projects. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, and hopefully it'll all work and it'll all be seamless.
I just realised that this has left no one introducing you, so we should say Dimitra, multi-mythopoeic scholarship award winner, outstanding contribution from the Tolkien Society this year, multiple monographs on Tolkien and fantasy, co-director of the centre, glorious and wonderful.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, I tend to forget that, but that's fair, I think. Okay, all right. So this is the PowerPoint about the series, and hopefully you can all see that. Yes, good. Okay, all right. So Matt, do you want to have a go first, and I will chip in.
Sure. So the Perspectives on Fantasy series was something which Brian will say a little bit more about how it initially came about. But Brian was a visiting professor with us a couple of years ago, and we were talking about how you can find places to publish science fiction scholarship. There are a number of established series, and some series will allow fantasy in as a sort of latecomer or a second string. There wasn't really a dedicated place for people to publish scholarship which they wanted marked primarily as scholarship on fantasy, and we thought that there probably should be. So we can, particularly since we have a number of people finishing PhDs, and we're aware of a lot of exciting projects in the works, and we're just not quite sure where they were all going, possibly into children's literature series, possibly into popular fiction series, possibly into science fiction series. But it seemed to us that a lot of these projects were fantasy projects. It would be nice if they could be labelled as such, providing valuable perspectives on fantasy. So we decided we would try and set up a series called Perspectives on Fantasy. We took the idea to Bloomsbury, to an editor who Dimitra and I had worked with before, we knew and liked, and we trusted would do a good job with the series. We proposed things and they liked the idea, and now here we are. So that's the first academic series, an exclusive critical focus on fantasy, publishing cutting-edge research on literature and culture, so trying to cover books, but also broader fantasy subjects, and also trying to be accessible to a sort of broader range of people where possible. So it's academic collections and monographs, but one of the main points of our agreement with Bloomsbury is that while the books will come out first in hardback, they are guaranteed to come out in paperback within around 12 to 18 months of the initial publication, at which point the ebook price falls to match the paperback price. So we thought, while these will never precisely be cheap books, they will hopefully be affordable by genuine human people as well as institutional libraries. And that was something we thought we wanted for fantasy scholarship. Dimitra, did you want to pick up anything else?
Yes. Well, no, I just wanted to talk very briefly about the idea of perspectives. You know, we like this idea of multiple ways of approaching fantasy, and also the sort of inclusivity of the word perspectives. And I think the logo picture, which is an old sort of a book illustration from the 19th century, captures that quite well. But can I just show you now briefly talking a bit more about the remit of the series. This actually at the top there is the logo of the series. So you will see it on Taylor's book there at the top, and that will appear in all of the books in the series. And we had a lot of back and forth about deciding on the logo, but you know, the two mountains, the sense of perspective, the moon there, you know, I think gave us a nice sense of the idea of perspectives and sort of a route through different approaches. So yes, the idea is that the series is a forum for theorizing and historicizing fantasy, and the scope is quite large. So we are happy to see books on major creators, on key works and modes, on the history of fantasy and its traditions, on the way that it's the different fantasy works are being drawn upon and reconfigured and reshaped and adapted by a number of different practitioners. So it's a on purpose a very inclusive scope of fantasy and the fantastic. If I move to the next one then, which again talks about scope, we are very keen to have approach to fantasy as a phenomenon that is global, that is diverse, that is inclusive. And that's why we're making a special mention in the description of the series about, yes, we of course, we will be addressing canonical Anglophone authors and texts, but we are very much keen to also see submissions on fantasy creators with works rooted in other cultures. So Asian, South American, Middle Eastern, indigenous cultures. You know, we want to see a very broad understanding of fantasy explored in the books of the series. And maybe, Matt, do you want to talk about that fan cultures as well, this being one of your main areas?
Yeah, so we're very keen to have sophisticated theorizations of fantasy, which I think is one of the things that Taylor's book does so well, but we're also keen to think about fantasy as a sort of shared fan cultural space and think about audiences and how they engage critically and effectively with the works, and also think about sort of one of the special sort of abilities of fantasy as a genre. I think it's far easier to see how people move from being readers and audiences to being writers and creators, and how people actually commonly occupy those different versions of those roles in different contexts. That sort of feels like it is a culture around, and perhaps the way that literary fiction does not so much. And so that was an aspect of fantasy we're very keen to see considered and reflected in the series.
Okay, a little bit more, not too much now to go. I would just wanted to give you a sense of the topics that may be included in the series, but I'm not, you know, this is not a restrictive or an exclusive list. Examinations of world building, development of narrative conventions, magical systems, constructions of evil, renegotiations of myths and histories, and creators' engagements with ethical, social, and ecological issues. And again, that's not, you know, there's scope for a lot more, but just to give you a sense of the types of things that we've already been commissioning, and you know, we're hoping to see.
We have to bite our tongues here, because there's some things very close to being agreed that are not yet agreed, but exciting books coming up, hopefully more soon.
We're not allowed to tell you yet, but yes, some very exciting stuff coming. And finally, the sort of the people behind the series. So I've already introduced, well, Matt kindly introduced me, and I've introduced my co-editors there. But this is our editorial board, which, as you will see, is very international and includes scholars from different places and different universities all over the world working on different aspects of fantasy and the fantastic. So we've tried to cover as much ground as possible in terms of different approaches to fantasy and the fantastic. And of course, you know, if you are working on a project at the moment and you are considering a submission to the series, we've included there the contact details of our editor, Lucy Brown at Bloomsbury. So that's the way to sort of first, that's who to approach and submit a proposal to, and a proposal form can be found on the Bloomsbury website.
She's doing a great job of looking after the series, and she's in the chat at the moment, which is wonderful to see.
Oh, that's great. Oh, lovely to have you with us, Lucy. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to pass on to Brian.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see this crowd. A few years ago, I was lucky enough to spend a term at the University of Glasgow, thanks to Rob Maslin, the Leverhulme Trust, and the School of Critical Studies. Part of what made my time there so special was finding a growing colony of fantasy scholars that included faculty like Rob, Dimitra Fimi, Matt, Maureen Farrell, Laura Martin, Rhys Williams, plus the developing scholars enrolled in the fantasy literature graduate program. I met with many of those students. I was duly impressed by the quality and variety of their projects. So many minds turned toward the fantastic in all its forms. The place was a beehive of critical activity. During my stay, we plotted further developments, a proposal for a center for fantasy and the fantastic, a regional offshoot of the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts, maybe even a book series. Why not dream big? So now we have a center. I'm including myself in that we, even from a few thousand miles away. We have a conference, which I plan to attend in July. We have a blooming or Bloomsburying monograph series. And the first book in that series grew out of a project by one of those emerging scholars. I knew from my conversations with its author, Dr. Taylor Driggers, that his study was going to be a significant addition to our field. It basically tells us that 3 different academic areas, religion and spirituality, gender studies and queer studies, and fantastic storytelling, that those 3 are really one and should be looked at together. I'm delighted to celebrate Taylor's achievement, and you'll hear more about that from the others. But I also want to celebrate the community that supports such work. When you have enough people who care about the same things, who talk to one another, who act as what Diana Glyer calls resonators, you start to develop a critical mass, a benevolent version of a chain reaction. Taylor's book, I think, will be the first of many written by him and by all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was absolutely lovely. I'm going to try not to cry now, so there we are. Taylor, this is over to you now.
Hey, thank you so much, Brian, and thank you to Dimitra and Matt as well. And really, I think what Brian said is absolutely true, that this would not have been possible without the fantasy community and center at Glasgow. And I can say that Dimitra and Matt and Brian and Lucy and everyone at Bloomsbury really have been just an absolute joy to work with in kind of bringing in bringing this project into the world. This is a little bit surreal for me now. That this started as my PhD project way back in 2015. So it's bizarre to have it being read publicly now. It still hasn't quite sunk in. I'm just going to share my screen now. And what I'm going to do is just give a little bit of an overview of some of the things that I'm talking about in the book, and some of the things that I'm arguing in the book, and why I'm doing those things. So if I can just start slideshow. Okay, so the book is called Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature, Fantastic Incarnations and the Deconstruction of Theology. Some bits and pieces of this talk are taken from the introduction of my book, but I also wanted to give just kind of a broad overview of some of the things that I talk about. I won't be able to give an exhaustive account of all of it, but just to introduce some of the ideas that I talk about in the book. I also want to give a little bit of a heads up that I will be talking a fair bit about sex, sexuality, and bodies in this talk. Do with that what you will. I also wanted to note that this talk will include brief mentions of homophobia, transphobia, and sexual violence. I won't be going into a ton of detail about any of those subjects, but they will be briefly mentioned. So I did just want to give a brief heads up there. So, fantasy literature has long been celebrated within Christian communities for its ability to give narrative form to theology at a remove from the usual trappings of religion. Reflecting on his creation of a fantastical gospel narrative in the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis commented that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Kath Filmer has even gone so far as to say that fantasy speaks religion. That is, religion is not simply a part of fantasy's aesthetics, its narrative register, or even its thematic content, but inextricably embedded within the form itself. Yet if fantasy's religious speech is often spoken in Christian registers, what remains to be examined is how it may do so for those of us who are marginalized by or within Christian traditions and institutions because of our genders, modes of presentation, and sexual desires? How might the creation of fantastical alternate realities, or secondary worlds, as J.R.R. Tolkien terms them, speak good news to those excluded and abused by the preachers of the gospel in this world? By stripping theology of its institutional bearing points, can fantasy texts also undress, as the queer theologian Marcella Althaus-Reid has provocatively phrased it, the patriarchal, heterosexual, and cisgender structures of doctrine? In the face of religious institutions that police and denigrate the desires and activities of our bodies, fantasy, in its fascination with fairies, dragons, and other strange beasts, may provide a space in which bodies that appear monstrous, impure, or other are embraced as holy. So in my book, I argue that fantasy literature carries a previously unexplored potential for articulating queer and feminist theologies and religious imaginaries. Taking up a deconstructive position within a Christian theological framework, it posits that fantasy texts can serve as fictional spaces in which theology can be reimagined from queer and feminist standpoints. My argument considers fantasy as a genre with potential not only for communicating religious doctrines, but also for interrogating them, holding them to account, and transforming them. This deconstructive approach gives special attention to how the defamiliarizing strategies of fantasy can help us to refigure God as the devalued and dehumanized other, against which dominant Western Christian subjectivity constructs and asserts itself. Using C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness and Earthsea novels, and Angela Carter's The Passion of New Eve as case studies, I argue that fantasy can be understood as an act of theological revisioning. And I'd just like to briefly note that in this book, I am talking about theology mostly in Christian terms because that is the primary theological paradigm I inhabit, but also partly because Christianity has widespread influence over the lives of women and queer people, whether we choose for it to or not, because it is a dominant religion within Western culture. I don't intend to foreclose other religious readings or theorizations of fantasy. And I invite scholars of other faiths and theological traditions to critique my work and to offer their own theorizations and readings. But I'm primarily coming at this from a Christian framework because that's the religious tradition that I'm familiar with. It's the theological paradigm that I inhabit. So most theological research on fantasy has been concerned with positing fantasy almost as a form of Christian apologetics, offering readings of fantasy as a literary form uniquely suited to the propagation of orthodox theological truth by a relatively narrow range of authors. And among those whose works tend to be the most commonly discussed in this context are C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, George McDonald, G.K. Chesterton, and Madeleine L'Engle, just to name a few. But it's generally understood within a relatively narrow range of accepted Orthodox beliefs. In the early 1990s, Kath Filmer theorized fantasy as a refuge for the religious in a world in which skepticism and nihilism have more currency and are regarded as more valid than religious belief, even suggesting that fantasy texts and their authors serve a priestly function of spiritual renewal and moral instruction. Meanwhile, Alison Milbank turns to the usual suspects, Lewis and Tolkien, in claiming that we need estranging techniques of fantasy if we are to shock people into engagement with reality, so that they may appreciate the religious sense, and we may begin to explain the Christian faith at all. So according to this line of reasoning, fantasy's purpose is to reinvigorate the theological imagination as it currently exists and bring the unconverted to the light of divine truth, to which an Orthodox understanding of the Christian tradition presumably offers privileged access. There are a number of reasons why I have problems with this understanding of fantasy's relationship to Christianity or its relationship to theology. But one of the reasons why I have problems with this approach is that it often inadvertently and sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly reaffirms theological doctrines and structures that are oppressive to women and queer people. Women and queer people may often have different relationships to things like divine incarnation or communion, ideas of spiritual community that are available to normative theology because of the ways that we move in the world and because of how we experience our bodies and because of our positions within religious life. We experience religious doctrines differently, and so we have different understandings of that come from our embodied experiences. We are also the other against which theology constructs its self-identity and its notions of the pure and sacred. So what I'm also not doing in this book is I'm not necessarily advocating for a form of theology that is more inclusive without changing much else. Inclusion into Christianity as usual, in my opinion, is not enough because it preserves those structures that construct themselves in opposition to difference. So what we need is a wholesale transformation of religious life and religious structures. And I think that fantasy can aid us in this. Fantasy is defined by its affinity for difference and its departure from normative constructions of what Catherine Hume calls consensus reality. And because of this, it opens the door for new possibilities in revisioning our conceptions of God, the church, and the body of Christ. And I use that term revisioning because it is a revision of theology, but then there's also a sense in which I think fantasy can serve a kind of prophetic role in challenging a lot of these doctrines and in trying to transform them. So fantasy also has a subversive potential because for many Christian readers, fantasy is not only a source of divine inspiration. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the same evangelical Christians that would happily read the Chronicles of Narnia or The Hobbit with their children also expressed consternation over the ostensibly corrupting and even demonic influence of texts like the television series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter novels, and the novels in Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. So fantasy's status as both divine and demonic, orthodox and heretical, profoundly religious and threateningly atheistic, make it particularly generative territory for those of us whose marginality in relation to dominant theological discourses demands a theology that navigates similar spaces between the sacred and profane. The inventive possibilities offered by the secondary worlds of fantasy mean that the religious landscapes of fantasy texts also need not be beholden to the histories and heritages that mark them in the primary world, lending writers and readers the ability to speak new figurations of God and humanity and new configurations of communion between them into being. So as this all suggests, fantasy does not only enrich our theological imaginations. Rather, in Heather Walton's words, literature resists being assimilated by theology and is as likely to confound our understandings of faith as to confirm them. So rather than an apologetics-based approach that has been adopted by previous scholars, I'm coming to fantasy's theological resonances from a marginal perspective that aims to disturb patriarchal heterosexual Christianity's claims to absolute authority and exclusive access to salvation. And my approach to this draws heavily on the work of Argentinian Scottish queer theologian Marcella Althouse Reid, whose project of indecent theology aims to point out how our supposedly transcendent concepts of God are inherently shaped by our sexual, social, and economic existences, and our position in relation to social and economic systems. So for her, God's incarnation in the person of Christ, who lived on the margins, conducted his ministry among sex workers, and who was executed by an imperialist power, paradoxically presents an opportunity to challenge institutional Christianity's role in policing and marginalizing the bodies of its subjects. In locating Christ not at the center of the church's practices, but instead in the sexual stranger at its gates, sharing in the embodied and chaotic lives lived at the intersections of racial, colonial, economic, and sexual oppression, Aldhouse Reed reclaims Christian spirituality as an act of queer resistance. And I have this quotation from here that I always love to quote because it's such a beautiful passage from her book, The Queer God. But she says that she's advocating a theology for sexual dissenters whose theological community is made up of the gathering of those who go to gay bars with rosaries in their pockets. Side note, I have 100% done this, or who make camp chapels of their living rooms simply because there is a cry in their lives, and a theological cry which refuses to fit life into different compartments. So what Aldhouse Reed is looking at is how do our spiritual lives bleed over into our sexual lives? How do our sexual lives inform the way that we understand God and understand ourselves in relation to God? So what implications does this have for fantasy? I want to unpack this a little bit before talking a bit more specifically about how some of the texts that I use as case studies embody this and put this in practice. And to do that, in my book, I engage in an exercise of rethinking one of the foundational essays for thinking theologically about fantasy literature, which is Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. So Tolkien has this concept of eucatastrophe that he talks about. And what he's referring to when he talks about eucatastrophe is the happy ending of a fairy tale or of a fantasy story. Tolkien describes it as a sudden and miraculous grace. And he associates this explicitly with the hope in the resurrection and the second coming of Christ. So in doing this, Tolkien is aligning the Christian story of the hope of salvation and the hope of resurrection with the structure of a fairy tale. And what I am basically trying to do in the book is kind of rethinking how this is framed, and asking whether that eucatastrophic hope, that hope of redemption or of liberation, could mean the failure of Christian doctrines rather than their fulfillment, whether we need a theology that embraces its own failure. And I think when we look at fantasy texts, we already see that fantasy is a genre that embraces failure. I think it was Brian, actually, who points out that fantasy tends to disavow its own validity, and it kind of avoids making final statements about anything. But by virtue of the fact that it's not only telling stories that didn't happen, but that couldn't have happened. These are stories that are impossible according to the rules of our world. And by positioning themselves as texts premised on impossibility, fantasy is doing something very interesting, and it's opening up a space for questioning and transforming and rewriting theology without asserting itself as the final word. I also talk a lot in the book about the relationship between eucatastrophe and desire, because I think that when we think about relationship with God as a relationship with the other, as this fundamentally ethical relationship that disrupt self-identity, that changes the way that we that changes the way that we think about desiring God and desiring the other as well. And that can often take on an erotic dimension. And I'll say a couple words about that in just a little bit when I talk about Till We Have Faces. This picture, by the way, is from the Netflix series Sense8, which if you haven't seen it, it's a great series for thinking through the relationship between spirituality and queer life. Highly recommend that people check it out if they haven't already. So one of the other things that I talk about in the book is that this potential to understand fantasy as theology in drag. So to do this, I look at Judith Butler's notion of drag as something that challenges our assumptions about binary gender, and that kind of parodies or disrupts the idea that with regard to gender, biology is destiny. And it's this very playful space where you can kind of try on different combinations of attributes and kind of open on to different ways of gendered being. And I think that fantasy can do that with theology in kind of borrowing theological concepts and defamiliarizing them and dressing them up in strange garb, having a little bit of fun with them, and maybe pushing our buttons a little bit with them, kind of disarming our prejudices that we might normally have, and kind of getting us out of our habitual ways of thinking about God and thinking about theology. And drag, obviously has a strong undercurrent of fantasy running through it. I have some examples here. So we have Sacha Velour as Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. There's also a picture of Charity Case, who some of you may recognize from RuPaul's Drag Race UK, dressed as a dragon there as well. Fantasy can maybe denaturalize our ways of thinking about God and saying, well, what else could we do with this? What could be possible if this one aspect of our theology is different? So I want to pivot a little bit now towards talking about some of the texts that I use as case studies and kind of thinking about what this looks like. And all of the theoretical stuff I've just been saying, what all of this looks like in practice. So one of the texts that I look at is actually a novel by C.S. Lewis called Till We Have Faces. It's one of his lesser known novels, but I think it's one with a lot of interesting and potentially subversive things to say about the relationship between theology, gender, and sexual desire. So Till We Have Faces is a reworking of the Greek myth of Eros and Psyche, and it follows Orual, who's a princess of the fictional kingdom of Glome, as she makes a complaint against the gods. Orual tells how her favorite half-sister, Psyche, has been sacrificed to the god of the mountain because the priests of the fertility goddess Ungit have declared her the accursed for tending to the people of Glome during a plague, to the extent that the people begin to regard her as a goddess herself. In a divine mystery, however, this is not just a punishment for a heresy, but also a reward. She is either to be devoured by the god of the mountain, or to become his bride, or both. Orual is disturbed when, after the sacrifice, she finds Psyche very much alive and apparently living in the wilderness, although Psyche insists that she is in the god's palace, a palace that Orual cannot see. She also tells Orual that the god is her lover, but that he forbids her from bringing light into their chamber during their nightly encounters. Deciding that foul play must be afoot, Orual persuades Psyche to enter the god's chamber with a lamp, for which Psyche is eventually sent into exile. So Lewis's text is set in a world in which, in the words of the priest of Ungit, holy places are dark places, and anything related to the gods is difficult to make sense of. It's a novel about the act of theological myth-making. Characters offer contradictory understandings of the gods themselves or events in the text that are often given no clear resolution. And this is a source of anxiety for Orual. Orual's deep discomfort with the temple of Ungit, a damp, womb-like space in which the goddess is embodied by a faceless slab of stone, also articulates anxieties around her own womanhood and sexuality, and her unreliable narration is reflective of a world in which women are taught to fear and distrust each other. I argue that Psyche's relationship with the god of the mountain and Orual's eventual spiritual conversion experience also prompt consideration of a feminist ethics of love and desire characterized by surrender to and non-possession of the other in all their unknowability. Psyche is also positioned by the text as a female Christ figure. At the novel's conclusion, she becomes a goddess, and she and Orual begin to take on salvific roles for each other, although the way that Lewis frames this is at times problematic, and I am critical of his characterization of Psyche for the way that it sometimes reproduces patriarchal prescriptions of good womanhood or divine womanhood. So kind of pivoting in a slightly opposite direction in terms of tone and aesthetics is Angela Carter's novel, The Passion of New Eve. So this novel follows an Englishman named Evelyn as he moves to an America on the brink of societal collapse. Journeying into the desert of the American West, he is kidnapped by an army of feminists led by a fertility goddess and plastic surgeon named Mother, who forcibly reconditions him into a woman destined to be a second Eve, and the Virgin Mary too, birthing a child who is meant to redeem the world from the sins of old Adam and of patriarchy. Eve eventually escapes Mother's underground world of Beulah and falls into a series of exploits where her newfound womanhood is put to the test. Her fate is also entwined with that of an aging Hollywood starlet named Tristessa de Saintonge, known for her performances of saintly feminine suffering, and the two eventually fall in love, although given the novel's dystopian setting, this doesn't end well. So in The Passion of New Eve, myth is a made thing, not a found thing, and Christianity is a site of parody and subversion that reveals its entanglement with other social and material forces in indecent ways. This is a novel deeply invested with the stories that we tell about gender, and it satirizes feminist attempts to rewrite theology that end up being every bit as oppressive and rigidly defined in their prescriptions of gender as patriarchal versions. It's also concerned with the very real ways that abstract symbols can impact our lives. And while it does not find an easy way out of this, its drag-like play with gender searches for a way of living our genders in a way that resists the roles that are preordained for us. Another novel that I use as a case study is Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. And you can see in the picture that I provided in the book cover that this is usually considered, and it's usually sold and marketed as a science fiction novel. It features space travel and interplanetary politics and future utopian societies. But I would argue that there's a lot about this novel's aesthetics and form and what it's doing that puts it at home with a lot of fantasy texts as well. There's a lot of unexplained mystical phenomena at work in it. And it also gives us bits of folklore and religious mythology from this world that in a way that makes it fit quite comfortably with fantasy, I think. So The Left Hand of Darkness is set on a planet with no binary gender. Instead, inhabitants of the planet experience fluid body morphologies and sexualities during their monthly cycles of sexual potency, which are known as Kemer. And I think I forgot to mention that the name of the planet is Gethin. That's not entirely relevant to what I'm saying here, but I just thought I'd mention it. So the story follows Genli I, a diplomat from Earth whose relationship with his chief Gethenian ally, Therum Harth Remur Estraven, comes to exceed the strictures of politics and instead reframes encounters with others across difference as both a queer bond of love and a deeply spiritual endeavor. So Gethin presents us with a society that is structured radically differently from ours thanks to its lack of binary gender. So it's kind of asking, how would familial relations be different? What would be different about political organization and the way that conflict is handled? How is labor organized differently when everyone has the potential to become pregnant? So it is radically rethinking a lot of things about the structure of our society, and what would happen to social structures without binary gender. And religion is part of that. And one of the things that actually underpins a lot of the thematic explorations of ethics and politics that the novel is engaged in is a fictional theology called Handara that structures the society of one of the nations on Gethin, the nation of Karhide. So Handara is characterized by a kind of lack of religious authority. It's a very kind of disorganized religion that is premised on failure. It's premised on the embrace of the unknown, the embrace of the other, the embrace of uncertainty. And that's something that comes very much into play in the relationship between Genli and the people of Gethin that we see unfold in the text, where Genli eventually understands his political project as something that is that is deeply mystical and something that requires him to completely rethink his sense of self-identity. So The Left Hand of Darkness is not the only Le Guin text that I look at in my book. A couple of other texts are the last two novels in the Earthsea series, Tahanu and The Other Wind. So these are texts at the end of the series where Le Guin is kind of rethinking the structure of her world building set up in earlier texts, which reads as very patriarchal. Le Guin has talked about her evolving relationship to feminism as being one where at the beginning of her career, she felt that she was writing as an honorary man. So Tahanu and The Other Wind are her revisiting Earthsea after she's kind of evolved in her relationship to feminism and kind of rethought her sense of gender. So the interesting thing about these final two novels is that they introduce these characters who are simultaneously human and dragon at the same time. The majority of these characters are women. They're often women who are on the fringes of society, who have been abused or neglected or cast aside by the patriarchal society that they live in. We first hear about this when the wizard Ogian encounters a fisherwoman who he gets a brief glimpse of as a dragon. And he says to the woman that I've suddenly seen your true form. You are a dragon, and this form of womanhood that you're wearing is a disguise. And the woman just kind of laughs at him and says, if only it were that simple. So it's troubling our notion of what identity is and what gendered identity is especially. There's where theology comes into play here is that much of the theological makeup of the world of Earthsea is based on this notion of true names, that the wizards of this world can somehow divine the true essence of a person or a being or a thing, and that name encapsulates the thing's whole being. And the dragon women challenge this in some interesting ways. There's an episode where this one woman who has demanded to be instructed in magic on the School of Rote, which only takes on male students, is challenged to a contest of magic where a wizard attempts to control her by speaking her true name. And she suddenly says, that's not all I am. That is not, I'm not only this name. And she transforms into a dragon and turns him into dust. And it's beautiful and amazing and great. But what the arrival of the dragon women in Earthsea also signifies is this complete reshaping of the world, this fundamental challenging of the way that people understand the world, this breaking of old taboos. And there's a moment where a character who comes from a culture in which dragons are sacred has a dream, and she says, I had this dream where I broke the taboo and I walked on the dragon's way. And the person that she's telling this to says, I think we're all walking the dragon's way. And I think we'll see a lot of these taboos be broken pretty soon. So that, I think, is an encapsulation, I think, of how, in looking at fantasy's potential for queer theology, we're not just talking about making theology more inclusive. We're actually talking about and demanding a wholesale transformation of what our religious structures look like, what religious life looks like, and what our world looks like. I've put on this slide just a few other texts that I talk about a bit more briefly in the book. I'll probably mention these a bit more when Meg and I talk in just a little bit. But these are a few other texts that I look at in my study. So just to conclude very briefly, fantasy can shake the gendered and sexual assumptions of patriarchal theology at their very foundations and disturb our notions of what messianic hope looks like. In fantasy, we can walk the dragon's way to find new and subversive possibilities for understanding divine incarnation, for encountering God as the sexual other of theology, and for understanding ourselves as queerly embodied theological subjects. Fantasy's potential to deconstruct and radically revision God, sex, and gender does not always promise easy gratification. But for authors and readers willing to risk opening themselves to transformation in the face of the other, it can challenge us to work provisionally towards a justice that is still yet to come. In this way, fantasy can recast the story of theology as one of joy beyond the walls of the world for those of us living outside the gates of normative Christianity. So thank you all very much for listening to that kind of overview of some of the things that I talk about in this book. And then here, these are just some of the sources that I've mentioned in my talk. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And at this point, I'm going to invite Meg McDonald to join me. So as mentioned earlier, Meg is part of the community at the Center for Fantasy and the Fantastic. She is a PhD researcher at Anglia Ruskin University, kind of focusing on belief and godhood in fantasy. And yeah, I guess, Meg, if you could just start off by telling everyone just a little bit more about your research and
yeah, my hot mess. Well, just so everybody knows, I wore my dragon scales in Taylor's honor and dragons, and also we've got a nice queer angel and demon on the shoulder, because I think that's kind of where we're both coming from. And I will say, there was some actual preach hands went up when Marcella came on the screen there. As our Taylor and our theorists don't always align, but that one just completely, like, we very much agree on. So I guess I started my PhD quite a long time ago, and whenever you're doing a part-time PhD, a lot of life can hit you squarely between the eyes while that's going on. But I remember thinking at the time, oh, how am I going to find enough enough to cover in this thesis about gods in fantasy. I'm going to do all of gods in fantasy. That was really dumb. And then I was like, I'm going to do gods from the 70s in fantasy. Well, there's a lot of that as well. So my primary reading, I've read over 380. This doesn't even these are books where the gods rock up, and that's how it got narrowed down. So there, there's a lot there. But when we talk about religion in fantasy and gods in fantasy and faith in fantasy and peace structures in fantasy, there, and religious structures, kind of like a theological framework. There's so many different sets. You've got ones where you've got like whole theological framework, no imminent God, no showing up. You've got tons of gods, no priests. You've got tons of gods, no faith. It's like pick and choose sort of stuff. So eventually I managed to narrow it down out of sheer desperation from 1989, because very conveniently this meant that I could have Terry Pratchett's Small Gods and Pyramids, and it was also the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what I'm doing what I'm looking at is how fantasy authors tie and use gods to look at grand narratives, a lot like yourself. And then I was like, all right, well, when is it going to end? Because fortunately, many of my writers are still living and adding to the series. Unfortunately, many of my writers are still living and adding to their series, which meant I was like, but this one also really covers it, and this one also really covers it. And so then, very unfortunately, Trump got into power. And so my bracket became the fall of the Berlin Wall to the rise of Trump's wall. So again, looking at how we create these sacred things that we cannot question in the real world, or when we question them in the real world, we get hit with hate in all sorts of formats. So that's where my research came. And I think a lot for those of you who are kind of watching, Taylor and I have had several conversations in the last couple of weeks about this, which have just gone like everywhere. But one of the things that kind of came through was Taylor uses theory to look at the text, and I use the text to look at theory. And that's not exactly the same, but it's really interesting to see the overlap. Do you think that's pretty fair?
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, one of the things that I really like about reading your work, or whenever I've seen you present at conferences, is that you do theorize by doing close readings of the text. And what I think is so great about that is that it models the way that fantasy itself can be used as theory, and can not just speak to theory, but can itself become a way of understanding these concepts. And I think that's so important in kind of making those things, I think, a lot more tangible and accessible, because it's easy to kind of, or like it's easy on one hand to kind of throw around a lot of buzzwords, but then when you're trying to think about what that actually is referring to, it's sometimes kind of hard. Whereas if you're looking at a fantasy story and kind of narrating the story alongside kind of talking about the concepts, it's much easier to kind of grasp and easier to wrap your head around and get a sense of what's actually happening with a lot of the theory. Does that make sense?
I think that's, so again, I think that might be why we both agree on Marcella, because she's a liberation theologian, but she was a practical theologian. Like, a lot of her theory is practical based and lived. Mm-hmm. It's that lived reality of it is, you said you've gone to, this is horrendous and far too much TMI. You've gone to a gay bar with rosary beads in your pocket. I've had to move the vibrators to find the rosary beads to take them for a funeral. And I was like, oh yeah, this is the hashtag Catholic moment. This is the sort of lived reality of when your faith and your sex life and your practice all kind of overlaps. And you bring that kind of vision with you when you read something. you bring that kind of urge to see something there. And I don't think you see things that aren't there. It's just you can find resonances. And I'm sort of, I know that we're jumping about, and I know we'll get to Q&A kind of there, but like, I think it's important. So the first question that was sitting in the Q&A, and you kind of covered it already, was why did you use Left Hand of Darkness, which other people would view as science fiction, and my urge to say was read the book because it's right there, right in the front page. But it was, you've taken fantasy as a lens itself. So not just, you know, could you share a wee bit about that, I suppose, really?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'm doing with that is that there's a passage, I'm again kind of going to be quoting Brian here, but in Brian's book, Stories About Stories, there's this great sentence where he says that the most interesting question isn't whether a text is fantasy or science fiction or horror or what have you, but it's what happens to the text when we read it as one of those things. Like what are we bringing to the text, and what are we expecting to find there? Mm-hmm. And I think that happens with fantasy and religion, again, by nature of the fact that fantasy speaks religion. It is drawn from the rhetorics of myth and of religious narrative. So when we apply that as a framework to a text, that stuff comes to the forefront. That stuff is really kind of brought forward. And it's kind of funny because I originally wasn't planning to write about the Left Hand of Darkness or any Le Guin in my thesis, largely because this didn't start as a fantasy project at all. It was only when I arrived at Glasgow and became involved with the fantasy community here, where I just finally bit the bullet and admitted that I'm a fantasy scholar. I picked up The Left Hand of Darkness at the recommendation of my cousin, and my cousin was just like, read this book because I think it really ties in with what you're planning to do with your research. And so from there, I was coming to it from that framework. And so that's already what I was bringing to the text, and kind of, so then when it became a fantasy project, it just became a really obvious thing to say, well, I've always been reading this as fantasy, you know, that's informed the things that I've found in the text. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I mean, I don't know if that answered anonymous attendee's question, but I mean, I read the book, and you and I have had this debate many times about, like, because I very specifically, I'm looking at genre fantasy. I'm not like, so for me, they are squarely, they're, you know, right in that wheelhouse, and in all different sort of categories, you know, if we use far as rhetorics of, you know, there's portal universe, there's intrusion, there's liminal, it's all kind of there, but they're all, you know, they're all definitely you know, fantasy as most people would expect it, but you know, there's still sort of scope to look at these things differently as well. And we've also kind of, I mean, we've talked about how texts become too sacred to be touched, mm-hmm. as well. So they can only be read, you know, you're only allowed to read them in a particular way if you are respecting, mm-hmm. established beliefs, or, you know, and obviously there's Bible, there's all the forms of sacred religious texts, and for, you know, for scholars, there's all these sacred fantasy texts, you know, and we've experienced that, you know, very recently. There's what happens when you look at Tolkien and you say, let's consider the other, or what happens if you look at C.S. Lewis and let's consider queerness. And you see some kind of real hate come out there as if it belongs so firmly to people that you're not allowed to find yourself in that if you don't fit. And I think, you know, when we've talked about queer theology, that's really, reading texts like that is really important.
Definitely. And it's kind of funny. We talked about this kind of in preparation for today. I actually had a Twitter comment in my mentions today, actually, saying, why do you have to insist on seeing yourself in all of these texts? And to me, this question is just, why not? At the very base level, I just have to be suspicious if somebody gets so upset at the notion of somebody wanting to read themselves into a text. And I think it's interesting because in the book, I talk a little bit about kind of different approaches to reading queer representation in fantasy. And I think coming from the queer theology angle, where a lot of queer theologians are kind of looking at Christianity and saying, look, if we do not make the effort to read ourselves into these texts and to reimagine these texts for ourselves, nobody's going to do that for us. And so I think that's one of the ways in which queer theology can speak to the ways that we engage with fantasy in fandom, both that's not only a valid thing to do, but that's also necessary, because representation is not always going to come from on high. You know, it's not always going to be given to you. And so that act of creative interpretation and saying, well, what if I read this character in this way? I mean, fanfic does this all the time, right? With headcanons and alternate universes and things like that, where you are actively revising the text. But I think that's something that we do in criticism as well. I think it's something that's always happening in criticism, whether you're aware of it or not. And I think the key is being honest about the fact that that's what we're all doing. You know, because let's be honest, you know, reading The Lord of the Rings, for instance, as an entirely white, entirely heterosexual text is also an act of creative interpretation. It's yep. Yeah. It's
really up there. It's also not in line with Tolkien's old pedantry about, you know, when he uses particular words, he means them. And they're like ancient versions. Anyway, we'll not go down this particular road, as the two of us have had a big rage rant about that. However, we probably should state we in the centre stand very closely with scholars who are under attack for just, you know, asking the same questions we're asking just now. I think perhaps one of the things that comes up though from that is them saying, but the author didn't intend that. They didn't intend for you to be able to see yourself there. But I remember getting told off as a kid, and I was like, I didn't do it. And my mum would be like, no, you didn't mean to do it, but it's still the consequences of it are still there. And I was sort of thinking about that today in terms of whether or not an author means or does not mean to write things in a particular way. It can be read, and it, you know, nothing exists in a vacuum. So you have these parts that sort of overlap all the time, and you kind of see these kind of ways. There are gaps in everything, you know. That's the point. That's how we're all there. I think, you know, a totalizing, all bound narrative was seen as a bad thing, you know, by Tolkien. And, you know, I don't know. I like that fantasy allows us to have those affordances, allows us to imagine ourselves in that world, because we're either directly in the text and it's being written there for us, or because there are the gaps and the spaces where you can find those kinships, I guess, or reflections.
Yeah.
I know because you flashed up that last screen, and also there's a question, were there any other books you wanted to include but didn't have the time? So we were saying my favorite chapter in Taylor's book, which I very encourage you all to read, is the fourth one, which has almost all of those texts in there as well. But let's talk a wee bit about them as well and the other spaces.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the interesting things about turning your PhD thesis into a book is that you get to kind of reassess your own work and rework it and add new things to it that you didn't get to add before. And for me, a lot of that involved just adding things that I read since completing the thesis, since handing it in, and that I found myself just kicking myself and going, God, why didn't I read this when I was working?
I told you to read it.
Yeah, but there was that in particular. Several years ago now, I saw a conference paper that Meg gave on N.K. Jemison's Inheritance trilogy. And I was just completely captivated by it and went just like, oh my God, I have to read Jemison now. And I didn't have the time and didn't have space to work that into the thesis. But in writing the conclusion, where I was kind of saying, here's some more recent texts that are doing some of this, I had to include Jemison because there's so much in Jemison's work, and in the Inheritance trilogy in particular, about the way that the kind of characterization of gods and the symbolic associations that we have with them are kind of embedded in these economic and racial and colonial and sexual structures. And I'm also really, really interested in the way that N.K. Jemison primarily characterizes her gods through eroticism. She has a background in romance fiction, and that really comes through in the Inheritance trilogy. So much character and so much world building is conveyed through characters' sexual encounters with gods and gods' sexual encounters with each other. So yeah, I'm forever grateful to you, Meg, for introducing me to those books. But a big one is also Samuel Delaney's Tales of Nivarion, which has a chapter in it where a character is telling her creation myth from the matriarchal society that she's from. And it is a matriarchal reworking of the creation story from the first couple chapters of Genesis, but it's rewritten where Adam and Eve are a lesbian couple and where God is gendered as female. And they're commanded to worship God and God's creation in all of its variety and in all of its difference. And the fall happens because they neglect to do that. They only worship God in the sky. And because of that, they neglect the fruit of the trees. And there's this like very profound image of the fruit and the trees all falling rotten to the ground. So it's performing all these interesting reversals of the creation myth of Genesis, but it's having this character say, this is divine truth, as opposed to your culture, which just happened by all of these different accidents and things like that. And Delaney's being a little bit cheeky there and kind of asking us to consider how any theological system is kind of shaped by its culture and its politics. The other text that I really, really want to put a spotlight on, because I don't think enough people have read it, is this short story by Kai Cheng Thom, she's primarily a children's author, but she has this one short story called I Shall Remain. And that story is narrated by a goddess, and it's describing this sacramental ritual that that is also evocative of sex work. And it's this meditation on the meaning of what divinity is, the meaning of bodily autonomy, it also gives her backstory where she used to have a privileged place in heaven, but she was cast out of heaven because of her desire to heal humanity. She has healing powers, and the healing happens through eroticism and touch. And it's a beautiful, beautiful short story that I'd encourage people to read. I know I've been talking for a while about all of these just because I'm
but I mean, I think
fangirling over all these things, but yeah.
I think those are, I mean, they're really important, particularly. So, I mean, one of the questions, you and I can go on at length about a variety of these books, but one of the questions from Andy is, how do you see a queer fantastical theology in the context of race? I'm thinking of the way that some brown bodies are coded as queer by default by white supremacist Christian patriarchy.
Yeah.
And we have N.K. Jemisin. We have this amazing series. It's 2 books, 3 novels, and 2 short stories, like a novelette and a short story that follows it. And there's this fantastic part in it where she looks at what the dominance, you've got this all-father theology that has come into play, and has enslaved the other gods, and you find out it's because he's broken, he's got some issues, but again, we were just talking about the culture shaping the god and the god shaping the culture, and the kind of white coded, white portrayed ish, because it doesn't map completely, have a tempest, this all-father god is your god. And then, we play into the later books after, balance, which is a freeing of the other gods, come back into it. And all of the statues of a tempest from that reign look like the white colonializing race. And then the god is in flesh, his chosen flesh, his accurate representation, not a projection or believer-shaped look of him. And one of the Ams says, "Oh, you're not white, effectively. You don't look like us." I guess, we all lie to ourselves effectively about what our faith structures are. And there's so much more in that with Jemisin and in kind of in the other ones as well.
Yeah. I mean, Delaney does so much with this too. As another Black queer author, where at the same time as you're interrogating norms of sexuality, that's also picking up a thread of race. I mean, that is kind of the guiding principle of intersectionality, right? That once you start picking at one of those threads, you start unraveling all of them and realizing that they're all kind of bound together in the same structure. And there's also one of my favorite moments in that Jemisin series. Actually, I don't know if I should say it because it would be spoilers.
It's been out for quite a while, and if you read a book pure, I mean, I'm with Clute on this one. If you read a book purely for the plot, you read it for her writing, read it for her descriptions, and God, read it for the hot gods. But but one of my favorite moments in those books is at the end, the colonial power of this world kind of ends up falling, and that fall is symbolized by this
act of queer eroticism between one of the members of the royal family and one of the gods who had been imprisoned by that regime and who had been sexually abused by that regime as well. And so that moment of this member of the royal family surrendering in this moment of love to this god that his family has imprisoned, and that moment of eroticism happening consensually it's such a profound encapsulation of how all of these things kind of inhabit the same space, that you know, to end heteronormativity, you have to end white supremacy and colonialism and all of these other things, that it's all bound together, and none of us are free until all of us are free, basically, to put it very simply.
I think that leads into 2 series that I would want to recommend, which I've recommended to you, that would recommend to other people quite a lot. One is Robert Jackson Bennett's Divine Cities series, which has a lot to do with colonialism and the gods, and a kind of, the gods are on the side of the colonial power at that point, and then that whole regime is overthrown and then suppressed, and that has a problem as well within it in terms of the suppression of a person's faith. You kind of, if you deny all forms of previous culture, and the various different ways that there is not a healing that can come either way, although we can understand it's a really interesting 3-book series, but very much is Max Gladstone's The Craft sequence, which is, it's like John Grisham meets John le Carre with Queer as Fuck. Oh, sorry. To be fair, we're really far through before I drop that. Necromancer, magicians, and gods, and colonial powers, and you know, various different land masses and faith structures that have had them, and like build your own idol worship space, and debt zombies. And it's a really interesting, I reached out to Max recently and said, have you read Marcel Althea's Read? And he was like, no, but what should I read? And I was like, this is, you know, it's a really beautiful thing. And I think it's actually one of the texts, as we were saying here, that is doing the theory work. Mm-hmm. It has an absolutely ripping set of plots, and it's really interesting because they were released non-chronologically. So the first one released was 3 Parts Dead, which actually comes in the middle. So you can either read them in order chronologically. You know, Last for Snow, kind of each book has a number in it somewhere where you can say, but I think it's really good to read them out of order, because you're seeing the kind of consequences of this in terms of faith, and you know, it does a lot of kind of this looking at faith and debt and corporations, and the kind of the capitalism that is linked with religions, and that if we, you know, again, like myself, if we pretend that it's not there, mm-hmm. we're just doomed to continually repeat it, and what we do to bodies about that. And there's a brilliant scene in it where one of the gods has died, and they're standing in this other world version of this sort of projected version of this corpse, and they're trying to work out how it happened. Was the god murdered? How did it happen? And it was like that people foreclosed their prayers on them, and they kind of like there was a run on the bank. So there was like a run on faith at that particular point. And it's a really interesting thing about what are we doing when we believe? What are we doing in ritual? What are we doing in faith? Where do we follow these kind of structures? And I don't know, there's so much. I can't wait till you've read them. There's so much
I really want to. Yeah.
And it's great because there's lots of different races and there's lots of different gender. Like I think there might be something that's heterosexual in it. I'm pretty sure, but I'm not like 100% sure.
It's always good when you can't remember whether there's any heterosexuals in it.
I mean, it's such a brilliant series in there, and I think that they're really interesting, and what they do as well. And I'm sort of thinking about The Other Wind, and Trudy's question here about queer reading of afterlives, is it has this kind of idea about queer time, queer families, queer afterlives, like what comes from that if you don't fit. This is what heaven is in this idea. This is what hell is. And do you want to pick on Trudy's, not pick on it, but like pick up Trudy's question?
Yeah, definitely. That was going to be the next one I mentioned, actually, just because I love that question. But yeah, that does give me an excuse to talk more about The Other Wind, which I love. But the thing that I find so interesting about the way that the afterlife works in The Other Wind is that the afterlife is literally a colonized space. And that, to me, has such strong resonances with all of the other things that we've been saying about how this kind of Western Christian self-identity is constructed in opposition to otherness. So, it necessitates this kind of suppression of the other and encroachment into the other's space and appropriation of it. The idea that I am this kind of eternal, completely integral subject that completely knows myself and will just can just dominate everything, I think is something that Le Guin is really critical of. And I think what you see in The Other Wind is that the wizards are embodying that notion. They're very, very afraid of death and this notion that they'll no longer be here, or that there's going to be some fundamental bodily change that they're going to undergo. And there's a beautiful passage where Tehanu, who's one of the dragon women in the series, just says, I think that when I die, I'll be able to give everything that I didn't do back into the world. And I just gave myself chills.
No, when I was rereading it the other day, it gave me chills as well, because it also made me think about mental health, which weirdly, so when one of the things that we face is we're pivoted with all the different lives we may or may not choose, and that kind of thought that there can be a healthy closure where you give that back into the world and it comes back properly. Does that make sense? I don't know. It's just her writing is so deceptively simple as well. It's just
I had a student who was recently doing a dissertation on Le Guin, and we spent an entire meeting trying to wrap our heads around what's actually happening in this bit in The Other Wind when they unbuild the wall, and it was we just kept going in circles. We couldn't wrap our heads around it, but you read it and it's there and it's very, very clear. And yeah, as Demetra said, it's also kind of challenging the idea that you'll keep your individuality in the afterlife, which makes me, it again brings me back to queer theology. But Lynn Marie Tonsat, who is another theologian that we both kind of use a lot in our work, but she talks a lot about this vision of the world to come, where all of our selves kind of co-inhere with one another without having to encroach on each other's space or interpenetrate with each other. And she uses the Eucharist as a way of kind of prefiguring this, where the body of Christ kind of comes to inhabit the being of wheat and the being of wine, but without any of those things losing their particularity. And then all of those things also come to co-inhere in the labor of the people who grow the food, the labor of the people who are administering it, the people who are participating in the act of communion. And so she does something so beautiful with that, where that is a prefiguration of the afterlife, where we are not able to maintain our individuality, and yet specificity remains. There's still community and difference within that. So we're not all absorbed into sameness either. It's this kind of branching out into difference that happens. And Tonstad is also a reader of fantasy as well. She's written on Jennison, and I'm sure she's read Le Guin.
Without doubt. Oh, I know she's read Pratchett and Gaiman, because she was at my talk. She was literature theology paper, and so she very much knew her fantasy. So I can see that. I think the other thing that she does, and Althea's Reid does, and actually fantasy can do, that works really well with queer theory, and it works really, it's really, and queer theology, but also ecological theology and everything else, is that this focus on an afterlife and what is perfection means that you stop paying attention to the world in which you're living and the responsibilities you have for the world in which you are living, and the interconnectedness of that if you're going to have Eucharist and communion within that, you have to think, where did the food come from? What were the conditions of the person that made that food? What were the things? So you have to look at a socially just, you have to look at all of these aspects, that nothing is in isolation. And I think kind of it's interesting to see how, that's offered up in different forms of fantasy, of kind of like, here is a way to look at how a different, be aware of the marketplace, or be aware of the chain of construction, because we are all brainwashed by capitalism and are used to it, but as Le Guin says, we were all brainwashed by the divine right of kings, and that went away. We can conceive, and I think that's it, that's fantasy as well. You can conceive of a world that isn't in this framework. And again, to pull that to my research, that's what I'm doing. I think that the authors particularly are purposefully putting these gods, these sacred, untouchable things, into a smoosh with humanity, so that they can consider change and critique and everything that we need to do, so that we don't freeze and fossilize and punish our future generations, as well as the world that kind of we're living in. And there's so many different ways that comes up, like the reading lists and everything else like that. I also like Tonstad's sort of, and you talked about this with I Shall Remain in the book, about the familial relationship, or her shining daddy, which we
shining daddy,
which we need a whole article just on the shining daddies of fantasy, and how there's problematic relationships there. But the queer family, that kind of what is the Fellowship of the Ring? But like this found family that that survive, some people come together with connections already, some people come for a purpose, for a period of time, and then those bonds last forever, and then you have like all these different ideas about that make that reevaluate like what your faith is with people and stuff.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, and I say this in the book in a footnote, I think, as well, but it's so weird once you start thinking about the way that certain forms of Christianity have been so invested in this structure of the nuclear family. When you look at the words of Jesus, he says, no, that doesn't matter. You know, if
well, it's
if
not exactly like a nuclear family unit himself. Like,
yeah, exactly. And you know, you have the complication of, you know, the Holy Spirit intruding on that on that family structure. And you know, the idea that your family is not just where you come from, it is who you are with, and the community that you are embedded within and committed to. So
I just, Demetrius, say, like, we need to start wrapping up, and we do, but that means I'm allowed to do the last shout out, which is for Bujold. So anybody who hasn't read Lois McMaster Bujold should 100% do it. And like Le Guin, she writes across science fiction and fantasy, but her Chalian books have the best queer pantheon, or one of the best queer pantheons, where you have all of the gods for the various different seasons and not, and so you're all, you know, heresy in that format is the binaries, it's the squared off version, and the queer space is opened up by the bastard, who is an integral, desired, wanted member of the family of gods. And, you know, I think that is just so kind of awesome.
Also, shout out to you, Meg, because you have an excellent book chapter on the queer Holy Family in Bujold's work. That's in a book of essays on Bujold that's co-edited by Dr. Una McCormack. That's just absolutely fantastic. And again, I think you articulate so well the reversals in that theological order that text is performing, where suddenly the totalizing structure is heretical. Okay, we really do need to wrap.
Everybody comes back.
We're running over, but yeah.
I mean, clearly we could go on for a lot longer, and I do understand that our Discord community is going to host a continuation of this discussion. I understand some of the sort of voice elements of that will be used. Gosh, yeah, I suddenly feel very old. I don't understand how that works on Discord, but apparently it works. So scroll back to find the link to our Discord community, those of you who want to continue the discussion there. One thing, first of all, to say that I should have said at the beginning, but it was also in all of our communications, is that as soon as we finish from here, we will email from the centre everyone with a flyer that gives you a 35% discount to Taylor's book. So that's coming up, and I will also remind people of where to find the recording of this. So before sort of thanking everyone and closing, I want to very quickly remind people what's coming up, because there's quite a bit coming up at the centre. So very briefly, save the date on the 25th of March, because we're going to have an event on fantasy and puppetry. And there are some brilliant, absolutely amazing speakers there, like Brian and Wendy Frood, William Todd Jones, Howard Gayton, Terry Windling, who's with us tonight, and Mary Robinette Cowell. So I'm so looking forward to this. Keep an eye out on our social media and our blog, and do subscribe to the newsletter. As soon as the registration is out, we will post it in all of those venues. I mentioned GIFCON earlier on. This is our annual conference, which is happening in April. Registration is open. That is going to be online this year. So do join us from all over the world. And the topic is fantasy across media. I understand we will be pretty soon announcing keynotes, which are, again, very exciting names, but I won't say anything yet because I'm not supposed to, not yet. Reminding again also about our Once and Future Fantasies, co-sponsored with the IAFA conference between the 13th and the 17th of July, with again some amazing keynotes, as you can see on the screen. And after that, early September, we have the 50th anniversary of Watch It Down by Richard Adams. And again, some amazing keynotes there, including Richard Adams's daughter, who heard the story first and will be there to speak to us. So do join us and do get involved with our social media, with our Discord community, etc. There is one more announcement that's going to happen tomorrow that, again, I'm not allowed to talk about, but keep an eye for one more exciting thing that's coming up tomorrow. So I'm going to stop sharing, and that's the last thing I'd like to do is, Brian, it would be lovely if we could get you back on the screen as well. I just would like to thank everyone for being part of this event tonight. Clearly, this was about Taylor's book and about a celebration of this scholarship on theology from a perspective that isn't often seen, and approaching fantasy from a perspective that isn't often seen. And I'm hoping this will be the first of many, and also to celebrate the launching of the book series with Taylor's book. So many thanks to Brian Atterberry, many thanks to Matthew Sangster, many thanks to Meg McDonald, and Taylor. Congratulations! We're all very, very proud of you, and thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming as well.
Thanks to all attendees. Yeah.
Send us your books when they are ready.
Yes, we want your books. Let us know what you're doing and submit your proposals. Okay, so I'm going to close this now, and that will stop the streaming as well. Thank you all again very much, and have a good night.